Hi, welcome back to the podcast. Today we are talking about Mystic River. It is a book by Dennis Lehane published in 2001, and then the movie Mystic River, directed by Clint Eastwood, was released in 2003. Now, I know I have already covered two Lehane books, making this one my third, and he is the only author that I have recurring podcasts for as of right now. And even though this one was on my list, it got moved up to the top of my list because someone requested it. So if you have a request, I've mentioned this before in a previous podcast, but if you have a request, then you can either comment on my blog, whythebookwins.com, or on my Instagram, which is whythebookwins. So Mystic River, the movie, came out in 2003, and it was nominated for a number of Oscars at the 2004 Academy Awards. And the 2004 Academy Awards is one of the Oscar years that I actually remember really well. Billy Crystal hosted, and I remember I thought he was hilarious. And then Lord of the Rings Return of the King just swept the Oscars. It was nominated for a lot, and then it basically won anything it was nominated for. So as the night went on, it got kind of annoying just constantly hearing that one called out. Obviously, though, it is a great movie. Pirates of the Caribbean, the first one, came out in 2003. So that was also nominated for a few things, and I was in a Johnny Depp phase at that time. So I remember hoping that he would win his Oscar for Best Actor. However, he lost to none other than Sean Penn for Mystic River. And so since I remember that year's Oscars so well, I of course was aware of Mystic River, and my family were big Clint Eastwood fans. Yet somehow this movie just kind of slipped away and I never ended up watching it. So I went into the book really knowing nothing about the storyline. Like, the only thing I remembered about the movie was that scene where Sean Penn is yelling and the cops are holding him back. And I seem to recall it was about a kidnap or something like that. And this book starts out with the kidnapping of one of the characters. And because I thought it was about a kidnapping, I assumed that that character was just going to be gone for good. So I was surprised to read just a few pages later when he is returned to his family. So yeah, it's just always a good time going into a story having no idea what direction things will take. And now a brief synopsis, which I've thought of if it's even necessary to do synopsises on this podcast, because I'm assuming if you're listening to this, you've probably either read the book or seen the movie or both. So it's not really like the synopsis is necessary, but I guess for now I'll keep doing them. If you guys have thoughts on it, go ahead and let me know if a synopsis is even necessary or if it's just a waste of time. So I'll keep this brief, the synopsis, but we have three boys, Jimmy, Sean, and Dave. One day they're fighting in the street when two cops drive up and they tell Dave to get in the car and they drive off with him. It turns out the men are not cops and Dave has been kidnapped. 4 days later, though, he's able to run away and he's returned to his mom. Fast forward about 15 years, the three are still living in the same town, and at this time, Jimmy's daughter, Katie, is found dead. Long story short, Dave's wife, Celeste, thinks Dave did it because the night she was killed, he had come home late covered in blood. The story he gives on where the blood comes from has a lot of holes in it, so she knows he's lying. And Dave himself seems to be going a little crazy due to the memories of his past kidnapping and molestation just coming to the surface. And then Sean is the cop in charge of catching the killer. And so this reignites his relationship with Dave and Jimmy and just reignites all of their connections again. And as the story goes on, Celeste ends up confiding in Jimmy that she thinks Dave killed his daughter. And so Jimmy then kills Dave. And at the same time Jimmy is doing this, Sean actually discovers who the real killers are and arrests them. The next day he finds Jimmy and he gives him the news. Jimmy is of course taken by surprise because he had thought Dave did it. And Sean knows that Jimmy killed Dave, but he doesn't have actual hard evidence to really lock him up for it. And that's basically the gist of the story. Oh, actually, I forgot to talk about the blood on Dave. So he claimed he was mugged and that he killed the mugger, or he beat him really bad and is worried he might have killed him, is what he tells Celeste. The truth, though, is that he saw a 12-year-old boy hooking outside a bar and was tempted to give in to this temptation that has been plaguing him. But before, he can think about it much more, he then sees the boy get into another person's car. They drive to a more secluded part of the parking lot, and then Dave drives over there and he kills the guy, and then the boy runs off and ends up leaving town. Dave hides the body in the man's trunk, and eventually it is found, but by this time, Dave himself has already been killed. So there's a lot of complicated themes going on in this book, and I think that's why it became so popular. Dave, Jimmy, and Sean share the lead role, and we see into each of their inner monologues. Sean is probably the least interesting of the three, whereas Jimmy and Dave have just a lot of complex and intriguing things going on in their lives. And then Dave's story is just so tragic and at times disturbing. He had this horrible traumatic thing happen to him when he was a boy, and then he was never able to talk about it and deal with it in a healthy way, process it. In the book, he arrives home and he tries to say something to his mom, but she shows that she has no interest in talking about it, and she just switched topics and acts like he, wasn't even saying anything. And so this thing that happened, it just is growing inside of him, and as he gets older, his past pain starts to just make him go a little crazy. But we'll get into that later. And then we have Jimmy, who had criminal tendencies starting at a young age. And by 17, he was in charge of his own crew. At 20, he is sent to prison because a guy named Just Ray ratted him out. And then while in prison, his wife gets cancer and she dies before he's released. So once he's out, he's left to take care of their young daughter that they'd had. And with this new responsibility, it motivates him to go straight. And he, buys a corner shop. And he remarries and has 2 more kids. But when he first is released, his last criminal act is to kill Just Ray, the guy who ratted him out. We also see into Celeste's thoughts, which I really liked. People who have only seen the movie, they have such a horrible opinion of her since it's her fault that Dave is killed. However, being able to see into her head just gives you more sympathy and pity for her and what she was going through. This book just really sucks you in, and it's hard to put down. Some of the stuff dealing with Sean is kind of boring, but aside from that, it just really, really has you. It also keeps you guessing on who it is that killed Katie. At times, it seems pretty convincing that it was Dave, but then new evidence or, some new detail will pop up that just doesn't coincide with it, and so then you have to rethink the whole thing. All in all, it is a great book. Because it deals with child molestation, it is not one I would recommend to just anybody, though. I mean, it never gets explicit with it, but it doesn't have to, because just alluding to that is disturbing and upsetting enough as it is. There is one thing with this story that it's not a plot hole, but it's just something I wonder about. So Dave's only family is his mom, and she's mentally ill. And when he returns, kids and adults in the town don't like being associated with him. And there's this part where Celeste is talking about how Dave is so at ease at social settings when he's around people who don't know about his past. But when he's with someone who does, he is just really uncomfortable and socially awkward. And so my question is, why did he stay in town? His only family was his mom. And she died at some point. But even so, when he was 18, he could have moved out and gone to a town far away enough that didn't know about his past, and then he could have had a whole different story, So it just didn't make sense to me that he would have stayed there if it, made him uncomfortable. Why stay? But anyway, that's just my thoughts. So on to the movie. We have Sean Penn, and as said above, he won an Oscar for this role, and he plays Jimmy, and he is great in this. I think he was perfectly cast, and he's just fantastic. He's the loving father who's heartbroken by the murder of his daughter while also being this hardened ex-con who is willing to kill in order to keep his family safe and to avenge his family. Tim Robbins also won an Oscar. He won Best Supporting Actor. He plays Dave, and he is also perfectly cast. Dave is described as being very non-threatening, his look is very non-threatening, and he looks younger than he is due to, his soft face. When reading this, I kept imagining David Harbour, even though he is not at all the way Dave is described. But in the scenes where Dave is just saying these crazy things and is being kind of scary, it's hard not to imagine someone who has that scary look. But Robbins, he does an amazing job, portraying the man who's suffering from his past and is losing touch with the world more and more as the book goes on, while also just being such a tragic character who just needs more kindness and understanding in his life. Kevin Bacon is solid as Sean. This role was actually given to Michael Keaton initially, and he even spent time shadowing the Boston police in preparation. A few weeks before shooting, he got in an argument with director Clint Eastwood, and he left the film. And so Bacon was then offered the role. I don't think Keaton or Bacon are the best choice, but regardless, Bacon does do a good job. So I don't have any complaints with his acting. I just don't think he or Keaton fit the description given in the book. Marcia Gay Harden gives an more amazing performance as Celeste. She was also nominated for an Oscar, however, she lost to Renee Zellweger for Cold Mountain. She already had won an Oscar, though, back in 2001 for her role in the movie Pollock. And the scene in Mystic River that just really sticks with you and where she just really stands out, in my opinion, is the very end during the parade. Laura Linney plays Jimmy's second wife, Annabeth. She had more of a presence in the book. And I was kind of disappointed they cut her character down. But at the time, Linney was actually filming Love Actually at the same time. And so she was flying back and forth between Boston and England. And so that sounds exhausting. We also have Lawrence Fishborne, who plays Sean's detective partner. Then Tom Geary, who isn't in too much, but he gives a fantastic job playing Katie's boyfriend, Brendan. He has some intense scenes, and he was fantastic. A 17-year-old Emmy Rossum plays Katie, and she's very fitting for the role. And then we have Eli Wallach, who has a brief cameo, playing the owner of Looney Liquor. And he and Eastwood were, of course, in the movie The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly together. So it's cool seeing them working together again. And then about the movie, not about the acting, but just a fun fact. Clint Eastwood actually did the score for this movie. I knew he liked jazz and musicals, or not musicals. I knew he liked jazz and classical music, but I didn't know he actually wrote music. So that's pretty cool. So the changes from book to movie, I'll start with the differences in their childhood. For starters, it's explained that all three were living in the town of East Buckingham, but Sean lives in the Point and Jimmy and Dave are in the Flats. And so the Point is where the richer people live, and then the Flats are where the poorer people and criminals are. Sean's dad is friends with Jimmy's dad. I forget how they even know each other, but they're friends, hence he and Jimmy hang out. They mainly hang out on the weekends, though, because kids in the Flats and kids in the Point go to two different schools. Dave also is part of this friend group, this trio, but he's just kind of a third wheel, and he's always there, but he doesn't always contribute much to the group. Sean is shown to be, the boy who has the most going for him, and he doesn't want to ruin his future by doing some of the shenanigans that Jimmy suggests. Such as, on the day Dave is taken, Jimmy suggests they steal a car and just drive it around the block. And for a second, Sean considers this, but then he realizes that, he'd be foolish to jeopardize his future and disappoint his parents by doing that. Jimmy gets upset, and then Dave also gets upset, and he actually pushes Sean. And so all three of them just start getting in this fight in the street. And then this is when the men drive up and they say that they can't be fighting in the street and say they're cops and that whole thing. In the movie, it makes it seem like the three of them were closer friends. And after the trying to steal a car thing, rather than getting in a fight, Jimmy suggests they write their names in fresh cement. And also in the movie, after Dave gets in the car, the guy in the passenger seat turns around and looks at him, and we see that he's wearing a ring showing that he's a priest in the Catholic Church. And this wasn't in the book, and I feel like it was unnecessary personally. Both the book and the movie talk about how there was trash in the floor of the back seat of the car. And later, Dave is thinking how that was the first warning sign. He noticed the trash at the time, but it wasn't until later that he realized, he'd had this feeling that something wasn't right. And looking back, that trash should have told him, like, hey, don't get in this car because this is clearly not a cop's car. And in the book, when they're questioning Dave and telling him to get in the car, Dave starts to cry. And Sean and Jimmy just feel uncomfortable and embarrassed for Dave, and so they're just staring at the ground. And then when Dave returns to school, kids are bullying him and saying terrible things about his time being kidnapped. And there were just a number of times in this book where it just kind of made me want to cry. And the scene where Dave is getting bullied at school was one of those times. Are kids really that mean and that cruel? It made me just want to reach out to young Dave and comfort him and help him find a therapist or someone so that he would have a way to deal with what happened. His mom, though, as I said, not only was she mentally ill, but they were also poor and couldn't afford a therapist, but still, something could have been done to help him. But speaking of kids being cruel, maybe this is foreshadowing in a way, since it ends up being two kids that kill Katie. The book and movie say they shot her on accident and then chased her because they didn't want her to tell on them. And this surprised me because I thought we would learn that it was premeditated because Silent Ray didn't want his brother leaving him to marry Katie. And I think that maybe was part of the motivation, but when they're arrested, they don't say that that was their main thing. So I don't know. Anyway, back to their childhood. Another change in the movie, when Dave is returned, Sean and Jimmy are outside of his apartment and they see him arrive. And then that's it. Like, the cops are there and Dave goes to his mom and they go inside the house and Dave looks out at Jimmy and Sean from the window. In the book, however, when Dave is returned, the town has a celebration. And so initially, Dave, they drive him up in a cop car and he's getting all this attention. And he's getting so much attention that Jimmy almost is like, he's feeling jealous. And he almost wants to tell his mom, like, hey, like, I almost got in the car too. And the whole town is out. And then someone starts playing music. And then vendors start giving away free hot dogs. And they turn the sprinklers on for the kids to run through. And they just have this full-on block party. Dave and his mom, however, they don't even stay for the party. They just go inside. And that's when Jimmy sees him looking out. Jimmy sees Dave looking out from his window. And Sean was not there at all because Sean lives in the Point and this is happening in the flats. And so I think the easiest way to break down the rest of this is to split it into 3 parts, one for each of the 3 main characters. So we'll start with Sean. In the book, when we see adult Sean, we find that he is returning to work after having been on a suspension. We also learned that his wife left him a year ago. She had been having an affair and then got pregnant, and Sean isn't even sure if it's his baby or not. He knows that he has become more withdrawn as the years have gone on, whereas his wife was a very lively and outgoing person, and so the more withdrawn he became, the more, she felt that disconnection from him. And just being a detective has made him start to feel bitter about life, seeing the terrible things people do, and, they do things for very little motive. In the movie, they say his wife is gone for 6 months, and they don't say that he was ever suspended. In both, we hear about his wife who still calls him, but she never says anything. He'll answer and he'll talk a bit, but then eventually she just hangs up. And in the book, it's from Sean's perspective, and when he tells someone about this, they're like, if she doesn't talk, then how do you know it's her? And he just says he just knows. Because we aren't told without a doubt that it's her, I kept thinking that these silent phone calls would end up contributing to the main plot in some way. Like, we would find out it turns out the person calling isn't his wife, but it's, just someone that has to do with the main storyline. But then when Sean arrests the killers, he himself is almost killed, and having that experience leads him to call his wife and tell her he's sorry. And she finally speaks, and she says that she's sorry too, and she agrees to come home. And when we hear this in the book, I was kind of bummed because I was like, what? Like, that was his wife the whole time. I thought it would be something more interesting. The book also has a bit more with Sean's dad. And during the investigation, he goes to see his parents, and we see more into his life and his relationship with them. And he talks to his dad a bit about the event with Dave when they were kids. And he also tells his dad about his suspicions about Dave. And the dad says that he doesn't think Dave could do something like that. On to Jimmy and Annabeth. So adult Jimmy is introduced when he gets the call telling him that Katie never showed. And so the guy working at the store needs help. And we learned in flashbacks about Jimmy's criminal past and running a gang along with the Savage brothers. And when he's released from jail, he ends up dating and marrying dating the only Savage sister named Annabeth. And the movie does a good job revealing all these things about his past through dialogue rather than actual flashbacks. And we're shown in both that he doesn't like Brendan or Ray Harris, but he claims that it's because, he knew the dad and he didn't like him, so he therefore doesn't like the kids. But everyone can tell that there's something more there. Katie is dating Brendan Harris, but of course she doesn't tell her dad because he's told her that in the past that, she could never bring a Harris home. In the book, it talks about who Katie was dating before Brendan, and it was this guy named Bobby O'Donnell, who is this up-and-coming, gang member, gang leader. And he has a friend named Roman who sees Katie at a bar the night she was killed. And Roman kind of threatens her, saying, Bobby wouldn't want you being out here, being drunk and embarrassing yourself, and you should just go home. And this whole Bobby and Roman storyline is left out of the movie, which is fine by me because it doesn't really contribute much anyway. So when Jimmy is outside Penn Park, that's when he sees that it's Katie's car. So he's outside the park and he calls Annabeth and he tells her. And she says, like, if it's Katie's car, like, why aren't you in the park looking for her? And he tells her that they can't. They're not letting him in. And she's like, well, you better find a way in. And after he hangs up, he's disappointed in himself because he's like, yeah, why haven't I just found a way in? Like, what am I doing here listening to the cops? And so then he does, as the movie shows, where, he uses the bolt cutters to get in. Speaking of Annabeth, above that phone call is a good example of, showing what kind of person she was. But these things are left out of the movie. And so in the end, the book and the movie have the scene where Jimmy confesses everything to her. And Annabeth is close to him and says that, they're strong and everyone else is weak. And that he's the kind of man who does whatever it takes to keep those he loves safe. The movie, it sort of feels like this almost comes out of nowhere, in my opinion, because we never really got a feel for who she was. They never fleshed her out, really. Whereas the book, you really got to know her. There's just a number of times where she's described as being, a straightforward, hard, strong woman. And, like a no-nonsense kind of a thing, like with that phone call. And there's this other part in the book where she's talking to Sean, and she says, life isn't happily ever after and golden sunset and crap like that. It's work. The person you love is rarely worthy of how big your love is because no one is worthy of that, and maybe no one deserves the burden of it either. You'll let them down, you'll be disappointed and have your trust broken and have a lot of really sucky days. You lose more than you win. You hate the person as much as you love him, but hell, you roll up your sleeves and work at everything because that's what growing older is. And so I just think that passage is a good example of the kind of woman Annabeth was. She was familiar with the harsh realities of life, but rather than those tough things making her weaker, they made her stronger. At least in a way. It also made her colder in some ways. Whereas people like Celeste, though, when things get tough, as we see in this story, rather than getting tough with it, she sort of wilts and becomes weaker. And at the end of the book, it's a week later, after Dave's death and all that. And there's a parade going on. Jimmy's upstairs and he's thinking about everything. And he has a conversation with Dave in his head. And talking to Dave, he admits that Dave, didn't have anything to do with Katie. But he convinces himself that Dave was going to end up hurting someone sooner or later. And he had killed a guy. And Jimmy says it was only a matter of time before he would do something to a child. And he decides to kind of embrace that darker side of himself and decides he's going to run a crew again and be the leader of this town. Up until this, I had liked Jimmy, but, killing Dave, this innocent man, sends him down a bad path, and the things he says and thinks about Dave just seem so harsh. To go side by side with that, we're then shown Sean, who is at the parade, and he's also thinking about Dave, but he's thinking in a kinder light, and he's remembering how he had told Dave that the two of them should grab a drink sometime, but then Sean never followed up on it, and now he regrets it, and he wishes he would have been a better friend to Dave. And then also, totally random side note about the movie. Did anyone else notice the sunglasses that Sean Penn wears? He puts them on 2 or 3 times, and they're these old man looking sunglasses with covering the side part too. It was just pretty distracting. Whenever he put them on, he looks like, I don't know, it just looked funny to me. Anyway, on to Dave and Celeste. So Celeste is the only wife who we see into, internally. And that Sunday morning at 3 a.m., she's sitting in the bathroom just wondering how things have gotten to this point, feeling like she's just stuck in a dead-end life, basically. And as she's thinking this, Dave comes in and he's covered in blood. And so while he showers, she takes his clothes and rinses them in the sink and then later bleaches the drain pipe to get rid of the evidence. She doesn't believe Dave's story, but the whole thing just makes her feel more awake and alive than she has in a long time. And then she puts Dave's clothes in a bag and she's just waiting for the trash day on Tuesday to throw them out. And then later, when she hears about Katie, she goes to Annabeth's house because the two of them are cousins. And during one of these times at Jimmy's house, Annabeth is upstairs and she hears outside the cops talking to Dave, Sean and his partner talking to Dave. And when Dave walks off, she hears the cops talking about how they suspect him. And they also mention how someone noticed a guy sitting out in the parking lot of the bar Katie was last in, and the car fits the description of Dave's. This is shown in the movie, her overhearing the conversation, but they leave out the storyline of Dave's car being seen. And also, they find blood in the parking lot of the bar, And so it's taped off to investigate. And they left this out of the movie. But when you're reading it, when we hear about this, it makes it seem like perhaps Dave isn't involved in Katie's death after all, because the blood found in the parking lot doesn't match hers. And so it's just another thing that holds John up from pinning it on Dave. Another reason for us to wonder. And then there were also footprints found in the park where Katie was. And so they see her footprints, but they don't see anybody else's. And Dave is big enough that he should have left footprints in the mud, but he doesn't. And so that's another mystery. Of course, by the end, we realize why. And it's because it was two kids chasing her. And because they're so light, they didn't leave footprints. So the movie does show Dave losing touch with reality and how, like in the book and the movie, he talks about the boy who has been showing his face too much lately. And the book has a passage that reads, "The biggest problem right now was that the boy who'd escaped from the wolves and grown up was showing his face too much. David hoped that what he'd done Saturday night would settle that, shut the boy up, send him back deep into the forest of Dave's mind. He'd wanted blood that night, the boy. He'd wanted to cause some pain. So Dave had obliged. At first it'd just been minor, a few punches, a kick, but then it had gotten out of control, Dave feeling the rage welling up inside of him as the boy took over. And the boy was one mean customer." And then there's the whole vampire wolf talk in both the book and the movie. But overall, the movie does a good job. But overall, I think Dave seemed more mentally unstable and scary in the book. And like, so the whole vampire conversation, they have it in both the book and the movie, but they cut it short in the movie. And so in the book, Celeste comes home and she sees that he's watching the vampire movie. And initially he seems fine and they're talking and he's even joking, but then he gets serious and Celeste tries to defend herself, just being like, "Oh, I just haven't been myself lately." And Dave says that no one has been themselves. And then he goes on to say, "Like this movie, they don't know who the real people are and who the vampires are. I've seen parts of this before, right? And that Baldwin brother there, he's going to fall in love with that blonde girl, even though he knows that she's been bitten. So she's going to turn into a vampire, but he don't care, right? Because he loves her. Yet she's a bloodsucker. So she's going to suck his blood and turn him into the walking dead. I mean, that's the whole thing about vampirism, Celeste. There's something attractive about it. Even if you know it'll kill you and damn your soul for eternity, and you'll have to spend all of your time biting people in the neck and hiding out from the sun and, Vatican hit squads. Maybe one day you wake up and you forget what it was even like to be human. Maybe that happens, and then it's okay. You've been poisoned, but the poison ain't that bad once you learn how to live with it." That's my opinion anyway. In the movie, after he says this whole thing, he starts to cry and then he talks about Henry and George. Whereas in the book, it says that he starts laughing, like in this weird, out of control laugh kind of way. And also in the book, when he's a boy, it talks about how the way he dealt with his kidnapping was to think of the men as wolves and not use their real names. There's times, though, when the names would just blare in his head and torment him. And so then later, when he starts using their names with Celeste, we can tell just how over the edge he is, because we know from earlier that, even thinking those names was just horrible for him. And then we get to Celeste's perspective, and she just has never been more scared and is realizing that she just has no idea who this man is that she married. They'd been together for like 10 years. And when she'd asked him about his kidnapping, he would just say, that he got into the car and then 4 days later he escaped. So this is the first time she's ever really hearing about it. And it's just all very upsetting. And Dave gets up and he goes to leave to go to the bar. And on his way out, he tells her that he got rid of his clothes that had the evidence on them. And once he's gone, Celeste, she's feeling panicky and she gets their son, Michael, and catches a taxi to go to a motel. And then the next day, Dave is taken into questioning, as the movie shows. And the movie does a good job showing how Dave outsmarts them with the whole car theft thing. In the book, Dave is thinking like how confident he feels. But the longer he's in there, he realizes that the only reason he was feeling confident was because he was still drunk from the night before. And as the day goes on, they leave him alone and he's just sitting in there. And he starts to feel sick and desperate. And he thinks how, if they came back in now, like he would just spill everything because, everything is just overwhelming him. However, they do not come back. They instead release him. So then he goes home. And once he's home, he has a few beers and his confidence comes back to him. He is mildly worried about where Celeste and Michael went, but he decides that, eventually he'll make things right with her and everything will be okay. But for now, he needs more beer. So he heads out to go to a bar, and on his way out, he comes across Val Savage, who drives up and asks if he wants to get a drink, and Dave is like, oh, this is perfect. Yeah, let's go out. And so in the book, it's just Val, and Dave gets in the passenger side. However, in the movie, they have it be two guys, and so Dave gets in the back seat, and this is, of course, very reminiscent to earlier in the movie when he's a kid, and he gets in the back seat of that car. And so both of these car rides lead to his death in one way or another. Meanwhile, Celeste just doesn't know what to do, and she thinks how if she still had his clothes, she could turn them into the police. But since she doesn't, she feels like it's not a good idea. And there's a passage in the book that helps us understand why she goes to Jimmy in the first place. She's thinking, without the clothes Dave had worn that night, it didn't make much sense to go to the police. She told herself this because she wasn't sure the police could protect her. She had to live in this neighborhood after all, and the only thing that could protect you from something dangerous in the neighborhood was the neighborhood itself. And if she told Jimmy, then not only he, but the Savages as well, could form a kind of moat around her that Dave would never dare cross. So since she's clearly wanting protection from Dave, that makes it seem like she didn't think Jimmy would actually kill him. She obviously wasn't thinking logically, though, because, she was panicky and stressed, and she was thinking emotionally. And she was acting from a place of fear. I think her character in the movie got too much hate, and, she was in a tough situation. And Dave, he wasn't making himself seem innocent the way he was talking and saying how he didn't have control over himself anymore. And so, she should have just gone to the police, but she wasn't thinking logically, as I said. And so in the book, at the end during the parade, Celeste is there, and she goes up to Sean, and she points to Jimmy, saying that he killed Dave. And Sean says he knows, and that he's going to get him for it. And this exchange is left out of the movie. The movie does do a great job with this scene, though, with Celeste's son coming up on the float, and she's calling out to him to get his attention, and he's just, of course, feeling sad and just looking down. In the book, it talks about how Celeste is clearly losing it, and the movie, Marcia Gray Harden does a great job with this scene. It's just so sad and heartbreaking, and you can just tell she's losing it, not herself anymore. It's just a really powerful end to the movie. So on to the details of Dave's death. The events with the Savages and then Jimmy joining them at the bar are pretty much the same in both the book and the movie. The bar is along the Mystic River, and the back is not visible from anywhere, and this is also where Jimmy had killed Just Ray. And when they get Dave out in the back, Jimmy asks Dave about the blood, and in both the book and the movie, Dave tells him the truth, but Jimmy doesn't buy it because Jimmy's at the point where the only answer he would accept is for Dave to say that he killed Katie. But a difference between the book and the movie is, in the movie, Dave says that he killed the man because he was scared of becoming that same kind of person. Whereas in the book, he thinks this, but he doesn't actually say it because he's just so ashamed, and it's one of those things that he would never want to actually admit out loud, even with his life at stake. And in the movie, when he makes this confession, it sort of comes out of nowhere. Like there was nothing leading up to us finding out who he actually killed. Because in the book, there's different scenes that happen that clue us into what really happened with Dave that night. Whereas the movie, they don't give you any backstory up until the very end when he's confessing it. So in the book, there's a scene where Val goes up to Jimmy and he's telling Jimmy how, he's been talking to everyone about Katie, doing their detective work. And he tells him about a girl he knows that hooks outside the bar. And she tells him about a 12-year-old boy that also works outside the bar, the one we mentioned earlier. And the kid would sometimes crash at her place, but she said she hadn't seen him in a while and something must have really scared him off to make him run away. And then, as I said, there's the talk of the blood in the parking lot. And then there's also the blood in the trunk of Dave's car. In the movie, they say it's the same blood type as Katie's. However, in the book, it's a different blood type. So the movie leaves out all these breadcrumbs we were given in the book that clue us into what was going on with Dave that night. And it says in the book that before he killed Just Ray, Ray had told Jimmy that you can't outrun a moving train. And Jimmy is thinking about this, and he says how he still doesn't know what Ray had meant. And the book talks about how Jimmy will have dreams about Ray. And now, a week later, after Dave, he's having dreams about him too. And so basically, robbery and theft and whatever is one thing, but murder is just something you can't run from. And it's going to haunt Jimmy now. hence you can't outrun a moving train. So in the end, the book or the movie, the directing, the acting, the cinematography, really everything about the movie is top tier. As much as people like the movie on its own, I would recommend reading the book, and I think it'll make you like the movie even more because you'll be aware of the details that the movie left out. In Lehane's The Drop book first movie, I said how the book had more details and more backstory, but the details weren't really pertinent to the story, so you could skip the book, just watch the movie, and you'd be fine because you just didn't need those backstories that were given. However, with Mystic River, getting those details makes such a difference. Even though I've covered a lot of the bigger details here in this podcast, there's still so much more in the book. And again, it's not a book I would recommend to just anyone, but if you're someone who saw the movie and liked it, I would highly recommend the book. So in the end, if I had to pick one or the other, as great as the movie is, the book definitely wins here. And then since this is the third Lehane book I have now covered, I thought I would rank them. Even though this book-movie combo is probably Lehane's most well-known, and the movie was very critically acclaimed, I actually think I would name Shutter Island as my favorite, which I have a podcast about that if you want to go check that out. Shutter Island just seems to have gone under the radar in a lot of ways, and both the book and the movie are so well done, and it's just Mystic River keeps you guessing, but Shutter Island are just some crazy twists. But Mystic River would come in second, and then The Drop would come in third for me. Lehane also wrote Gone Baby Gone, which I also plan to cover on here. However, since I've already done 3 of his books, I'm probably going to give Dennis Lehane a break for now and cover some other authors. But he's a great writer, and his stories are always very gripping and hard to put down. And so far, I mean, all 3 movie adaptations have been really good, which The Drop, I like the movie even better than the book. So thanks for listening to this podcast. I hope you enjoyed it. If you tune in next Wednesday, I will be covering Annihilation, and you can join me as we enter Area X together.